Hey guys! Tonight we begin with the remarkable stories of the most wanted people in medieval history. Those infamous names whispered in candlelit taverns, carved into royal decrees, and occasionally scribbled onto wanted posters, assuming the monk hadn't run out of parchment or motivation. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. William Wallace, the man, the myth, the headache of King Edward I. Born somewhere in Scotland around 1270, Wallace was supposed to live the quiet life of a minor knight. Maybe fight a few skirmishes, drink some ale, complain about the weather, normal medieval hobbies. Instead, he decided to go full most wanted mode by sticking it to the English crown. His crime? Existing loudly as a Scot. The fun began when English troops killed his family. Wallace's response? Go on a murder tour of English garrisons. Not the diplomatic approach, but definitely memorable. He quickly graduated from local nuisance to Scotland's favourite rebel uncle, the guy who shows up at family gatherings and says, "Who wants to overthrow a king today?" His greatest hit was the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297. Imagine thousands of English soldiers trying to cross a rickety wooden bridge, while Wallace and his men waited with sharp sticks and bad intentions. The Scots let them shuffle halfway across, then hacked them down like they were weeds in need of pruning. It was less of a battle and more of a group humiliation. England left with fewer men and zero dignity. Naturally, Edward I, also known as Hammer of the Scots, because apparently passive-aggressive Tapper of the Scots was taken, was furious. Wallace, meanwhile, was enjoying outlaw life, raiding, vanishing, reappearing, and generally making England look like the world's worst babysitter. But every medieval rebel has an expiration date. Wallace's came in 1305 when he was betrayed, captured, and hauled off to London for a trial that was basically a theatre performance. The charge? Treason. His defence? I can't betray a king I never swore loyalty to. The judges? Not impressed. Verdict? Guilty. Execution in medieval England was never just, let's kill him. Oh no. They wanted a show. Wallace was dragged through the streets, hanged until half dead, chopped open like a piñata, and his organs flamboyantly removed. Then they cut him into quarters and mailed the pieces around England as a sort of motivational poster for anyone thinking of rebelling. His head got prime real estate on London Bridge, staring down commuters like a very aggressive welcome sign. To Scotland, Wallace was a hero. To England, he was a cautionary tale. To everyone else, he was proof that in the Middle Ages you could go from minor knight to national icon to dismembered street decor in record time. Forget Robin Hood. William de Morisco was the upgrade nobody asked for but everyone got. Where Robin allegedly robbed the rich and gave to the poor, William robbed the rich and then kept it. Because honestly, who wouldn't? Born into a noble but problematic family in the early 13th century, William grew up with the kind of resume that makes kings twitch. His family was already accused of treason, which in medieval terms was basically genetic. Instead of playing it safe, William leaned in. Why settle for being a regular noble when you could be a pirate, a rebel, and possibly the most irritating island landlord in England? The drama peaked when William was accused of trying to assassinate King Henry III. Now, if there's one surefire way to get your face plastered on every wanted list, it's attempted regicide. The Crown didn't just want him arrested, they wanted him turned into a cautionary bedtime story. So William fled to Lundy Island, a rock off the Devon coast that became his personal villain lair. From there, he launched a career in piracy. He raided ships, robbed merchants, and turned the Bristol Channel into his own medieval toll booth. Except instead of handing you a receipt, he stole your cargo and sometimes your crew. Merchants complained, the Crown fumed, and William just kept cashing in like the sea was his personal ATM. For nearly 2 decades, he made himself a royal nuisance. Think about that. 20 years of making King Henry III look like he couldn't control his own coastline. The king finally snapped and sent a small army to storm Lundy Island. William, shockingly, lost. Turns out, ragtag pirate crew doesn't beat angry king with soldiers. His execution in 1242 was medieval performance art. First, he was dragged through London streets to remind everyone what happened to people who annoyed the crown. Then hanged, drawn and quartered, the full deluxe package. His body parts were distributed across the kingdom like grim party favours. The message was clear. Don't rebel, don't pirate, and definitely don't try to stab the king. William de Morisco may not have inspired ballads, but he didn't need to. He was living proof that being most wanted in the Middle Ages wasn't about justice or morality. It was about how spectacularly you managed to irritate a king, and in that department, William was world-class. If you were making a list of people medieval kings wished would just stay quiet and embroider, Eleanor of Aquitaine would be at the top. She wasn't just smart, she was dangerously smart, which in the 12th century was the fastest way for a woman to get labelled a heretic, a witch, or my ex-wife. Born in 1122, Eleanor inherited the Duchy of Aquitaine, one of the richest regions in France. Translation: she had more money, land, and influence than half the noblemen combined, and they hated it. She married King Louis VII of France, went on the Second Crusade with him, and proceeded to make him look incompetent in front of half of Europe. She suggested military strategy, organized supplies, and rumor has it, even showed up dressed like an Amazon warrior. The French clerics clutched their rosaries so hard they probably left dents. The marriage ended badly. Louis wanted a quiet, obedient queen. Eleanor wanted to actually run things. Divorce followed, and within months she upgraded to Henry Plantagenet, soon to be King Henry II of England. It was the medieval equivalent of dumping your boring boyfriend and immediately dating the hottest, most chaotic rock star in Europe. With Henry, Eleanor had 8 children, including 2 kings, Richard the Lionheart and John Loses Everything Lackland. But she wasn't just raising royal babies. She was running governments, advising on politics, and occasionally stirring rebellion when Henry annoyed her. And he annoyed her often. By 1173, she openly supported her sons in a revolt against him. Family dinners must have been lively. Henry eventually got tired of her scheming and locked her up. 16 years of imprisonment, because apparently being clever and ambitious counted as high treason in a wife. Yet even behind bars, Eleanor remained a political powerhouse. She was freed when Richard took the throne and immediately started managing the kingdom like it was her personal project. By the time she died at age 82, practically prehistoric by medieval standards, she had outlived both husbands, watched 2 sons become kings, and left behind a dynasty that would shape Europe for centuries. The church called her scandalous. The kings called her dangerous. History calls her brilliant. Eleanor of Aquitaine wasn't just wanted. She was the medieval reminder that intelligence, ambition, and ovaries made for a combination most men simply couldn't handle. If you think teenagers today are dramatic, wait until you meet Joan of Arc, a 15th century French farm girl who told everyone she heard voices from saints, then proceeded to lead armies into battle like she was born with cheat codes. Born in 1412, Joan was a peasant with 0 military training, but she insisted God had chosen her to save France from the English during the 100 Years' War. Most people would have laughed, but France was losing so badly that the royal court basically said, "You know what? Fine, let's see what the teenager can do." Desperation makes for strange hiring practices, and somehow it worked. Dressed in armor, carrying a banner, Joan became a mascot, and miracle worker rolled into one. French soldiers, usually demoralized and half-drunk, suddenly rallied behind her. In 1429, she lifted the siege of Orléans, a victory that shocked everyone, especially the English, who had just been beaten by a girl who couldn't even legally drink their weak medieval ale. But Joan's rise was as fast as it was dangerous. Kings don't like being upstaged, and church authorities don't like teenage prophets handing out military advice. Worse, she became a national symbol, which in medieval politics meant she was now a walking target with a bullseye painted by God himself. Captured in 1430 by Burgundian allies of the English, Joan was sold like cattle and handed over for trial. The English called her a witch, a heretic, and a cross-dresser, because yes, wearing armour was apparently more offensive than leading an army. The court proceedings were a circus of loaded questions, trick traps, and clergy who had clearly decided on the verdict before she even spoke. In 1431, at the age of 19, Joan was burned alive in Rouen marketplace. Crowds gathered, not to mourn, but to watch the show. Public execution was basically medieval Netflix. Joan went up in flames, literally becoming on fire for the last act of her short, chaotic life. Decades later, the church did a medieval oops and cleared her of heresy. Then, nearly 500 years after frying her, they canonized her as a saint. Nothing says we made a mistake, like elevating someone from witch to holy icon. Joan of Arc wasn't just wanted. She was the nightmare of every medieval power structure. Young, female, stubborn, and inconveniently successful. If medieval rulers were brands, then Vlad III of Wallachia had the most aggressive marketing campaign in Europe. Forget the bold or the great. He was Vlad the Impaler. Subtlety? Never heard of it. Born in 1431 in Transylvania, yes, the place every vampire movie points to with jazz hands, Vlad inherited a throne, a temper, and a knack for extreme problem-solving. His nickname came from his favourite hobby, impaling people on wooden stakes. Criminals, enemies, diplomats who annoyed him. No one was safe. He didn't just execute people, he turned executions into public art installations. Imagine walking into town and finding a literal forest of corpses swaying in the wind like some grotesque Christmas display. His relationship with the Ottoman Empire was tense, in the same way fire and gasoline have a tense relationship. Sometimes he paid tribute, sometimes he didn't. Once, he invited Ottoman envoys to his court and noticed they wouldn't remove their turbans. Vlad, ever the gracious host, had their turbans nailed to their skulls. Problem solved. Cultural respect achieved. But his most infamous stunt was during a major Ottoman invasion in 1462. Sultan Mehmed II marched in expecting a fight. Instead, he found 20,000 impaled bodies lining the roads, rotting in the sun. The message was clear. Welcome to Wallachia, population. You, if you're not careful. The Ottomans were so horrified they turned around. Terrorism as national defense, grim but effective. Of course, branding yourself as the guy who stabs people with trees doesn't win you many friends at home either. Local nobles hated him. Rival claimants wanted him gone. Even his allies side-eyed him. Depending on the chronicle, Vlad was either a patriotic hero defending his people or a sadistic maniac who made Genghis Khan look like a kindergarten teacher. Eventually, his enemies caught up with him. He was killed in battle, or possibly betrayed, or maybe assassinated. Accounts differ, but one thing's certain. He didn't retire peacefully with a pension and a garden. His head was sent to the Sultan as a trophy, proving that even the impaler could end up impaled by politics. Centuries later, Bram Stoker borrowed Vlad's name and reputation for his vampire Count Dracula. So yes, Vlad's branding stuck, literally forever. Not many rulers get remembered for their stake collection. In short, Vlad wasn't just wanted. He was the medieval equivalent of a viral horror meme. Every medieval most wanted list needs at least one guy who couldn't pick a career path. Enter Eustace the Monk, former Benedictine monk, part-time sorcerer, full-time pirate, and occasional accountant. Yes, accountant. Even criminals had to balance the books. Born around 1170 in Boulogne, Eustace started off in a monastery. For reasons historians still debate, boredom, bad beer, or a particularly stern abbot, he ditched the monk life. Supposedly he even studied black magic. Was he really a wizard, or was this just medieval rumour mill slander? Hard to say. But pirate wizard definitely sounds cooler than disgruntled ex-monk with anger issues. After leaving holy life, Eustace dabbled in law, then promptly broke it. He clashed with the Count of Bologna, which escalated into full-blown outlawry. With the king's men chasing him, Eustace did what any sensible fugitive would. He ran to sea and became a pirate. Not a yo-ho-ho romanticised pirate either. More of a burn your ships, rob your cargo, laugh while doing it type. Operating out of the Channel Islands, he terrorised merchant ships and coastal towns. Sometimes he fought for France, sometimes for England, sometimes for himself. He was basically the medieval gig economy in human form, switching employers whenever it suited him. Picture a mercenary on LinkedIn with endorsements for plundering, tax evasion, and black arts. By 1212, Eustace had carved out such a reputation that both England and France wanted him dead. He played both sides during the wars between King John of England and Philip of France, raiding ports and charging protection fees like a medieval mob boss. The English crown accused him of treason. The French accused him of betrayal. Merchants accused him of ruining their lives. Basically, everyone had him on speed dial for most wanted. His end came in 1217 at the Battle of Sandwich. Yes, that's the actual name. Eustace was captured by English forces after his ship was cornered. Offered the chance to surrender for mercy, he declined, which was bold, because his captors promptly chopped off his head. No trial, no delay. Just quick decapitation, and a collective sigh of relief from every sailor in the Channel. Eustace the monk wasn't remembered as noble or tragic. He was remembered as the chaos button everyone regretted pressing. Pirate, sorcerer, accountant, and eventually, cautionary tale. Most generals struggle to win battles with full use of their senses. Jan Žižka of Bohemia said, "Hold my beer and my eyeball." He lost one eye early in life, then the other later on, and still managed to be one of the most undefeated military commanders in history. Yes, undefeated. Blindness, 0. Žižka, 100. Born around 1360, Žižka grew up in a turbulent Bohemia where religion, politics, and general bad vibes collided. When the Hussite Wars broke out after Jan Hus was burned for heresy, Žižka joined the rebels. The Catholic Church and Holy Roman Empire thought they were fighting disorganized peasants. Žižka proved them wrong by turning farmers into an army that chewed up knights for breakfast. His genius? The war wagon? He basically invented medieval tanks. Heavy wagons chained together into mobile fortresses, bristling with crossbows, pikes, and early firearms. Imagine rolling up to a fancy armoured knight on horseback, only to be blasted in the face by a peasant hiding behind a wooden cart. Knights hated it. Peasants loved it. Žižka's wagons turned every muddy hill into a death trap. Even after he went totally blind, Žižka kept commanding. He used messengers and memory to direct battles, relying on sound, instinct, and the sheer terror he inspired in both friends and foes. His soldiers followed him, not just because he was smart, but because losing wasn't on the menu. Ever. Under Žižka, the Hussites won battle after battle against crusades sent by popes and emperors alike. His reputation grew so fearsome that enemies sometimes refused to fight him outright. Stories circulated that Žižka's mere presence could doom an army. It didn't matter if he couldn't see. His enemies saw him just fine, and that was enough. He finally died in 1424, not from battle but from illness. A disappointment to anyone hoping for a Hollywood ending. According to legend, Žižka ordered his skin to be made into a war drum so he could keep terrifying enemies even after death. Whether or not that's true, the rumor alone was enough to keep knights awake at night. Jan Žižka wasn't just wanted, he was unavoidable. The blind general who beat everyone, left undefeated, and basically turned peasant uprisings into one long medieval TED talk on why you shouldn't underestimate farmers with carts. If Scotland had William Wallace, Wales had Owain Glyndwr, the man who basically looked at English authority and said, "Not today, Henry." Born around 1359 into a minor noble family, Glyndwr had enough wealth to be respectable, but enough national pride to make himself very inconvenient for the English crown. In 1400, fed up with English rule, Glyndwr declared himself Prince of Wales. Not kind of Welsh, not local leader, but the actual prince, as in, "Move over, monarchy, this is mine now." Bold move. Risky too. Within weeks he went from landowner to most wanted with a price on his head. What followed was a rebellion that England couldn't quite crush. Glyndwr rallied farmers, nobles, and anyone else who hated paying English taxes, so everyone. He fought guerrilla-style, ambushing troops, torching castles, and vanishing into the hills like a medieval Batman. His supporters even drafted plans for an independent Welsh church and parliament. For a moment, it looked like Wales might actually break free. And then came the English response. Henry IV threw armies at him. Henry V threw bigger armies at him. Every time the crown thought they had Glyndwr cornered, he slipped away. His ability to avoid capture bordered on supernatural. Villagers swore he could vanish into mist. Others claimed he had spies everywhere. Realistically, he just knew the Welsh terrain better than the invading knights in their shiny, clanky armour. But rebellions run on money and morale, and both eventually ran out. By 1415, Glyndwr's forces were scattered, his castles lost, and his family captured. Yet the man himself? Gone. No dramatic last stand, no execution, no heroic martyrdom. He simply disappeared. One day he was leading a revolt, the next he was a rumour. Some say he died in hiding. Others whispered he was still alive, waiting to return and finish what he started. The English crown hated this so much they kept officially listing him as a fugitive for years after he was probably dead. Nothing's more embarrassing than being haunted by a guy who may not even exist anymore. Owain Glyndwr remains a national hero in Wales, the ghostly prince who defied the English, vanished into legend, and left behind a story too good to kill. For England, he was the rebel that got away. For history, he's proof that sometimes the most wanted man is the one you never catch. When you think of a medieval noblewoman, you might picture embroidery, poetry, and the occasional diplomatic marriage. Elizabeth Bathory apparently missed that memo and instead went for possible serial killer and unofficial brand ambassador for blood-based skincare. Born in 1560 into Hungarian high nobility, Bathory had it all. Castles, wealth, servants, and more power than most men could handle. And that, naturally, is where the rumours began. By the early 1600s, whispers spread that Elizabeth wasn't just bossing around peasants. She was allegedly murdering them. Hundreds of them. The stories claimed she tortured young girls and bathed in their blood to keep her skin smooth. If true, she basically invented Sephora's most terrifying loyalty program. Now let's be clear. Some historians argue these tales were exaggerated, or even fabricated. After all, Elizabeth was a rich, powerful widow, sitting on land that a lot of ambitious men wanted. And in the 17th century, accusing women of witchcraft, heresy, or general evil vibes was the fastest way to get them out of the picture. So was she really a vampire countess, or just a victim of medieval smear campaigning? Hard to say. What we do know is that in 1610, King Matthias of Hungary finally sent investigators. They arrived, checked out her castle, and claimed to have found dead or dying servant girls everywhere. Testimonies piled up. The number of victims reported ranged from a few dozen to over 600, because apparently subtlety wasn't medieval rumour culture's strong point. Elizabeth never faced a public trial, probably because her noble status made it awkward to execute her. Instead, she got the medieval equivalent of being cancelled, permanent house arrest. Except in her case, it wasn't a cosy cottage. They literally walled her up in a chamber of her own castle, with only small holes for food and air. Imagine a medieval timeout that lasted 4 years. She died in 1614, still bricked into her castle room. Whether she was guilty of mass murder, or simply guilty of being an inconveniently powerful woman, the legend stuck. To this day, she's remembered as the Blood Countess, the woman who may or may not have been trying to outdo Dracula in skincare routines. Elizabeth Bathory wasn't just wanted, she was infamous, a mix of horror story, political cautionary tale, and the reason no one in Hungary looked at bathtubs the same way again. If history had a category for worst career transitions, Gilles de Rais would win gold. He went from celebrated knight and national hero to one of the most infamous criminal cases of the Middle Ages. Think French war hero turned true crime podcast subject. Born in 1405 into a wealthy noble family, Gilles rose to fame as a commander alongside Joan of Arc. Yes, that Joan of Arc. When she was rallying French troops against the English, Gilles was right there in shining armour, fighting bravely, earning titles, and collecting more land and castles than he could reasonably manage. For a while, he was basically France's golden boy, rich, decorated, and close to royalty. Then came the plot twist. After Joan's execution, Gilles retired from war life. Retirement, for most nobles, meant hunting, politics, or throwing endless banquets. Gilles apparently decided, nah, I'll try something darker. Rumours spread that he squandered his fortune on extravagant plays, alchemy experiments, and, according to his accusers, outright murder. Not just one or two murders either. We're talking possibly hundreds of children. The accusations were grim: kidnapping, torture, ritual killings. Testimonies at his trial painted him as a monster hiding behind velvet curtains. Of course, this was the Middle Ages, where exaggeration was practically a sport. Some historians argue the charges were inflated to strip him of wealth and power. Others say the evidence, bodies, witnesses, confessions under questionable circumstances, was too overwhelming to dismiss. Either way, the French crown wasn't about to let the scandal slide. In 1440, Gilles was arrested, interrogated, and put on trial. His defense? Basically non-existent. He eventually confessed, though whether it was out of guilt, coercion, or the realization that he was doomed is anyone's guess. The verdict? Guilty on every count. His sentence? The deluxe medieval execution package, hanged and then burned. Because apparently one method wasn't enough for a man this notorious. On October 26, 1440, Gilles de Rais met his fiery end in Nantes. Crowds gathered, not out of pity, but to watch the spectacle. Execution Day was medieval Europe's favourite form of reality TV. So what do we make of Gilles de Rais? To some, he was a scapegoat for political greed. To others, he was the boogeyman of French history. Either way, he became the ultimate cautionary tale. Today's hero can be tomorrow's horror story. If medieval authorities hated anything more than rebellion, it was a woman with opinions, especially ones written down. Enter Marguerite Porete, a French mystic who in the late 13th and early 14th century decided the church wasn't explaining God properly and took it upon herself to write a book about it. That alone was practically a death wish. Her work, The Mirror of Simple Souls, wasn't some casual devotional. It was a full-blown mystical manual that argued true spiritual freedom meant being beyond the rules of the church. Translation: you don't need priests, rituals, or bishops. You can just vibe directly with God. That idea went over about as well as telling the IRS taxes were optional. For a while, Marguerite actually got away with it. Her book circulated. People admired it. And some even copied it by hand. But word spread up the clerical food chain, and soon the theological watchdogs were on her case. The book was declared heretical. She was ordered to stop distributing it. Marguerite's response: a polite but firm no. This was not the answer the Inquisition wanted. So in 1308 she was arrested and put on trial in Paris. Her interrogators expected grovelling, repentance, maybe even tears. What they got was a woman who flat out refused to deny her book, back down, or play the part of the frightened heretic. She stood her ground with the stubbornness of someone who knew the ending was already written. The verdict, unsurprisingly, was guilty of heresy. And because medieval punishments were never subtle, the sentence was death by fire. On June 1st, 1310, Marguerite was burned at the stake in front of a massive crowd. Public executions weren't just justice. They were entertainment, and nothing drew an audience like a condemned heretic. The irony? The mirror of simple souls survived. Despite being banned and condemned, copies kept popping up. Centuries later, theologians would praise it as one of the finest works of Christian mysticism. In other words, the church killed the author, but couldn't kill the book. Medieval censorship. Not exactly flawless. So Marguerite Porete joins the most wanted list, not because she raised armies or poisoned kings, but because she wrote something too radical, too defiant, and far too inconvenient to be ignored. Her crime was thinking too hard, and refusing to apologize for it. Everyone remembers Guy Fawkes, the man who tried to blow up Parliament in 1605, and instead blew up his own reputation. But centuries earlier, Europe already had a whole parade of let's try to explode things and hope for the best types. Spoiler, it almost never worked. Take the 14th and 15th centuries, when gunpowder started trickling into Europe. Suddenly, ambitious rebels looked at barrels of the stuff and thought, what if instead of fighting knights, we just turned castles into fireworks? It was the medieval version of discovering matches, and immediately deciding to juggle torches indoors. One early example came from the Hussites in Bohemia during the early 1400s. These were peasants fed up with church corruption, and they loved a good bang. They didn't just use gunpowder and cannons, they experimented with primitive bombs, flinging them at enemy troops. Half the time they went off too early, making the user the main casualty. But hey, when it worked, it made a very loud point. There were also smaller, more personal attempts at medieval demolition. Would-be assassins sometimes tried to blow up enemy strongholds or sabotage supply wagons with barrels of powder. The problem? Medieval engineering was not subtle. Sneaking a giant wooden barrel filled with explosives into a guarded castle courtyard was about as discreet as walking into church with a live goose under your arm. Someone always noticed, and when these plots failed, which was often, the punishment was spectacular. Rebels were hanged, drawn and quartered, or roasted alive next to the very barrels they'd hoped to ignite. Authorities didn't just execute you, they turned your botched fireworks show into a warning. What makes these pre-Fawkes figures so fascinating is how determined they were. Despite near zero chance of success, they kept trying. It was like medieval slapstick. Rebels sneaking barrels of powder around, while guards squinted suspiciously at the obvious trail of black dust on the floor. By the time Guy Fawkes came along, the idea of blowing up your enemies with powder was old news. He just went bigger and failed harder. But his medieval predecessors? They were the guinea pigs of gunpowder rebellion, proving that while dynamite makes for great theatre, it rarely makes for successful politics. In the Middle Ages, going boom or bust almost always meant bust, followed by your body parts being displayed in several counties as a very loud reminder not to try it again. Most wanted figures in medieval history earned their status by being rebels, pirates, or serial irritants. Saladin? He made the list simply by being too good at his job. That job happened to be humiliating European crusaders. Born in 1137 in Tikrit, Saladin rose through the ranks to become Sultan of Egypt and Syria. While European kings were busy tripping over their own armor, Saladin was uniting Muslim forces and actually getting things done, a shocking concept in the Middle Ages. He didn't just fight, he strategized, and worse, he kept winning. His biggest power move came in 1187 at the Battle of Hattin. The Crusader army, bloated with overconfidence and underprepared for desert heat, staggered into Saladin's forces like drunk tourists lost in the Sahara. He crushed them, captured their relics, and then took Jerusalem. To the Crusaders, this wasn't just a loss. It was the loss, the one that made popes scream into pillows and kings vow revenge. So naturally, Saladin shot straight to the top of the most wanted list in Europe. The Pope called for another crusade, kings packed their bags, and suddenly Richard the Lionheart was sailing across the Mediterranean with murder and probably gout in his heart. Here's the twist. Even his enemies respected him. Unlike most medieval warlords, Saladin wasn't a fan of gratuitous slaughter. When he retook Jerusalem, he didn't massacre the inhabitants like the Crusaders had done decades earlier. He let many live, even ransomed some, and in general behaved like a shockingly decent human being. Medieval Europe didn't know what to do with this. They wanted a monster to hate. Instead, they got a competent, polite adversary who occasionally sent his enemies fruit baskets. His rivalry with Richard the Lionheart became legendary. These two spent years fighting brutal campaigns, only to occasionally pause so Saladin could send Richard medicine when he fell ill. It was less mortal enemies and more weirdly respectful frenemies with swords. Saladin died in 1193, not by blade or betrayal, but from illness. When he passed, he left behind little personal wealth, despite ruling vast lands, because he'd given much of it away. Europe still saw him as a nightmare, but a nightmare wrapped in courtesy and honor. So yes, Saladin was absolutely most wanted. But he was also the rare enemy who managed to be admired while still making popes spit blood. That's efficiency. Some rebels fight on horseback, some hide in forests. Hereward the Wake? He chose swamps. Nothing says, "Catch me if you can," like living knee-deep in mud surrounded by mosquitoes the size of pigeons. Born around 1035, Hereward was an Anglo-Saxon noble who didn't take kindly to William the Conqueror, showing up in 1066 and claiming England like it was an empty Airbnb. When the Normans started carving up land, Hereward decided he wasn't going to be someone's peasant. Instead, he went full outlaw, raiding Norman settlements, ambushing soldiers, and generally being the human equivalent of a thorn in William's armoured backside. His legend really grew at Ely, a marshy stronghold where he and a ragtag band of rebels holed up against Norman forces. Imagine a bunch of angry farmers, exiled nobles, and probably a few drunks with pitchforks all standing ankle-deep in bog water, shouting insults at knights who couldn't figure out how to charge through a swamp. The Normans hated it. The locals loved it. Hereward became the folk hero nobody could pin down. The stories about him quickly turned into half history, half comic book. One tale claims he disguised himself as a potter to sneak into enemy camps. Another says he fought a bear with his bare hands. Did he really do these things? Probably not. But in the Middle Ages, facts were less important than making sure the guy annoying the king sounded unstoppable. William the Conqueror threw everything at Ely: bribes, siege engines, armies. But Hereward slipped away again and again. Eventually, the rebellion collapsed under the weight of betrayal and superior Norman resources. But Hereward himself? He just vanished. Some sources say he made peace with the Normans and retired. Others claim he was killed. The most entertaining version? He went back to the swamp and stayed there, laughing at everyone from behind a curtain of reeds. To the Normans, he was a criminal. To the Saxons, he was a hero. To historians, he's a headache. Because separating fact from legend with Hereward is like separating mud from swamp water, messy and pointless. Hereward, the Wake proved you didn't need an army, or castles, or even dry socks to be most wanted. All you needed was grit, a swamp, and the willingness to make the most powerful man in Europe feel like he'd lost a game of hide-and-seek. Not every most wanted medieval figure was a queen, knight, or pirate. Sometimes it was just a hungry farmer with very bad timing and a rabbit in his pocket. In the Middle Ages, hunting rights were not for everyone. Game animals, deer, boar, rabbits, technically belonged to the king or the local lord. Yes, even the rabbits. You could break your back ploughing your lord's fields all day, but if you so much as snared a bunny to feed your starving family, congratulations. You were now a criminal mastermind. Poaching wasn't a petty offence. It was treated like full-on treason. Medieval law codes spelled it out clearly. Kill a deer, lose a hand. Set traps in the royal forest, face prison. Repeat offender, execution. Imagine explaining to your neighbours that you were hanged for stew. Of course, peasants still did it. Hunger is persuasive. A rabbit could mean the difference between your kids surviving winter or becoming another sad entry in the parish death rolls. So they poached, quietly, cautiously, and usually at night. They used snares, nets, and the occasional bow. And every time, they risked their lives for what we would now consider a small appetizer. The punishments were designed less to stop poaching and more to remind peasants of their place. Lords wanted it clear. This forest is mine, these animals are mine, and also your dignity is mine. It was medieval gatekeeping at its finest. Meanwhile, the nobility held massive hunts where dozens of deer were slaughtered for sport. Fairness was not on the medieval menu. The irony is that poachers became folk heroes. Ballads and stories turned them into clever underdogs outsmarting greedy lords. Robin Hood, whether real or not, was the ultimate poacher fantasy, the outlaw who gave peasants hope that someone was sticking it to the elites. In reality, most court poachers didn't get ballads. They got fines, beatings, or a one-way trip to the gallows. So while kings and knights strutted around with banners and swords, some of the most wanted people in medieval history were just peasants chasing dinner. The rabbit might have been small, but the consequences were enormous. In a world where survival itself was a crime, every poacher was living proof of the cruel absurdity of medieval justice. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you could do wasn't plotting treason, starting a rebellion, or claiming a throne. It was trying to eat. In the Middle Ages, forests were more than just wilderness. They were political statements. A king's authority could be measured not only by the crowns he wore or the castles he built, but also by the stretches of land he could reserve for his own pleasure. When a monarch declared a royal forest, it didn't always mean a dense woodland filled with deer. It could be meadows, marshes, or even villages that suddenly fell under the iron rule of forest law. To the ordinary peasant, this meant their backyard could transform overnight into a forbidden kingdom, one where even picking up fallen wood could be punished, as if it were treason. For the rulers, however, these forests were playgrounds of power. Kings and nobles would parade through them with retinues of knights, squires, falconers, and packs of hounds bred for the chase. Hunting here was not just about filling the royal table with venison, though the taste of stag was considered fitting only for the nobility. It was about spectacle, ritual, and control. When a monarch pursued a stag across the land, it symbolized his dominance over both nature and man. The deer itself often carried almost sacred status, referred to as the king's game, an animal too noble for common hands to slay. Meanwhile, peasants looked on with a mixture of fear and resentment. To them, the royal hunt was a reminder that the land they toiled upon was not truly theirs. If hunger drove a farmer to snare a rabbit in the royal preserve, he risked mutilation, imprisonment, or worse. Chroniclers tell us that under William the Conqueror, punishments for poaching in the New Forest were brutal enough to terrify generations. It was a system designed to keep commoners hungry and kings powerful. And yet, there was no denying the grandeur. Picture the sound of horns echoing through the trees, the thunder of hooves, the furious barking of hounds, and finally, the triumphant moment when the stag, exhausted, was brought down. For a medieval king, this was more than sport. It was a living metaphor for rulership, tireless pursuit, relentless control, and the right to decide who feasted and who starved. A royal hunt in the Middle Ages was no casual stroll with a bow. It was a carefully choreographed ritual, almost as formal as a coronation. The day began at dawn, with squires and servants bustling around in preparation. Horses were groomed, hounds were leashed but restless, and falcons perched hooded on the gloved arms of their keepers. Every detail, from the king's choice of mount to the banners fluttering in the morning mist, was designed to remind everyone watching that this was not simply a sport, but a declaration of hierarchy. When the horns finally sounded, the hunt moved like a travelling court. Pages carried spears, huntsmen led packs of baying dogs, and nobles vied for a place near the monarch, hoping to share in his glory. Each participant had a role: the huntsman to track and flush out the prey, the master of hounds to unleash the chase, and the falconers to demonstrate their birds' uncanny precision in striking down smaller game. Even the spectators, ladies of the court perched on horseback or in carriages, played their part, oohing and applauding at each display of power and skill. The hunt itself could stretch for hours. A stag might lead the royal party through rivers, over ridges, and into deep cover, pursued relentlessly by hounds. It was exhausting work, and not just for the animal. Horses stumbled, dogs fell behind, and courtiers struggled to keep pace. Only the most determined, or most ambitious, stayed close to the king. To drop back was to lose visibility, and with it, political influence. To remain near was to prove loyalty and stamina, qualities valued in both hunting and governance. When the quarry was finally surrounded, a ritual kill often followed. The honor of striking the final blow usually belonged to the monarch or a noble of his choosing. Kneeling huntsmen would present the knife or spear, while heralds and musicians heightened the moment with sound. Blood was not only spilled, it was sanctified, sometimes smeared on the foreheads of young squires as a grim initiation rite. Thus, the medieval hunt was never just about meat or sport. It was a living theatre of authority, discipline, and symbolism. The forest became a stage, the animals unwilling actors, and the king always the star, master of the chase, master of the realm. If the royal hunt was a theatre, then the animals were the most carefully trained performers. To hunt without them would have been like holding a feast without music. Every noble household prided itself on its kennels and mews, for dogs and hawks were more than tools. They were status symbols. Hounds were bred for specific roles, each type reflecting centuries of selective breeding and noble preference. Greyhounds, with their sleek bodies and lightning speed, were ideal for chasing hares across open fields. Mastiffs, massive and muscular, were valued for their strength and ferocity when cornering wild boar, a quarry dangerous enough to kill a man with a single charge. Scent hounds, like the ancestors of today's bloodhounds, had noses so keen that they could follow the faintest trail through tangled woods. To command a pack of such beasts was to display wealth, patience, and mastery over nature itself. Then there were the birds. Falconry was an art form, practiced with near religious devotion. A noble might spend years training a single hawk, teaching it to strike pheasants, partridges, or even rabbits with flawless precision. The sight of a falcon launched from the gloved hand of a king, soaring, circling, and finally swooping down upon its prey, was a visual metaphor for rule itself, swift, decisive, and absolute. Not everyone, however, was permitted to wield these birds. A strict code determined which rank of noble could fly which species. For example, only emperors could legally keep a gyrfalcon, the rarest and most prized of hunting birds. To own one without the proper title was an insult to the very order of medieval society. Hierarchy extended even to the care of these animals. Entire staffs of huntsmen, falconers, and kennel masters devoted their lives to tending the beasts. Their expertise gave them surprising influence. A falconer trusted by the king might whisper in his ear during the long hours of waiting for prey. Servants of the hunt lived close to power, and their loyalty could make or break reputations. Thus, hawks and hounds were not just companions of the hunt, they were embodiments of the medieval obsession with order, status, and control. In a world where lineage defined destiny, even animals were ranked, and their use carefully regulated. The chase was as much about displaying who had the right to command nature as it was about the thrill of pursuit. If medieval hunting had a crown jewel, it was the pursuit of dangerous game. Stags were noble, hares were nimble, but wild boars, those bristling, tusked beasts, were the true test of courage. A charging boar could gore a horse, disembowel a hound, or kill an armed man in an instant. Chroniclers loved to describe these hunts, not because they ended in feasts, but because they separated pretenders from warriors. A king who stood his ground against a boar earned admiration. One who faltered earned whispers behind his back. Boar spears reflected this high-stakes game. Unlike simple lances, they had crossbars below the blade to prevent the furious animal from rushing further up the shaft once impaled. Even so, hunters risked being dragged to the ground in a frenzy of thrashing hooves and snapping tusks. It was not uncommon for nobles to be gravely injured or killed during such chases. But that was precisely the point. Danger gave the hunt meaning. To kill a beast that could kill you back was a badge of honor, a statement that you had earned your place among the powerful. Stags, too, held symbolic weight. Known as the king of the forest, the stag's strength and endurance made it a favorite quarry. Entire hunts could last from morning until dusk, with the animal leading its pursuers through rivers, over ridges, and across treacherous ground. When finally brought down, the stag was often honored with elaborate rituals, its antlers displayed like trophies of rulership. In medieval imagination, the stag symbolized both Christ and kingship, noble, elusive, and sacred. To hunt it was to engage in an act that blurred the lines between religion, nature, and monarchy. And then there were the bears, wolves, and even exotic beasts imported for staged hunts. In parts of Europe, bears were baited for spectacle, while wolves were relentlessly tracked as enemies of livestock and civilization itself. Some monarchs, eager to showcase their grandeur, imported lions or leopards to release in controlled hunts, because nothing said, "I rule the world," quite like chasing down a beast from another continent. These dangerous hunts carried a message louder than any sermon. The king was master over life and death, over beast and man alike. By triumphing against nature's fiercest creatures, rulers turned violence into pageantry, a performance of survival, courage, and unshakable dominance. When the chase was over and the quarry slain, the medieval hunt transformed from a deadly pursuit into a banquet of authority. The feast was the natural climax of the day's exertions, a chance to turn sweat, blood, and dust into ceremony. Hunting was never just about killing animals. It was about displaying how those animals could be consumed, divided, and shared as tokens of power. Venison, the flesh of the stag, was not ordinary meat. It was the food of kings and nobles, reserved by law and custom. While peasants might gnaw on mutton or pork, the rich crimson meat of the deer was forbidden to them, just as the forests that held it were. Serving venison at a banquet was a clear signal. This table belongs to privilege. Other game, boar, hare, pheasant, even swan or crane, appeared in extravagant dishes that bordered on the theatrical. Meat was spiced heavily, presented whole, and sometimes accompanied by elaborate sugar sculptures or heraldic displays that reminded guests they dined in the presence of majesty. But the food itself was only half the story. The hunt was followed by a ritualized distribution of spoils known as the curé. This was a ceremonial butchering of the animal, often done in full view of the court. The choicest cuts were reserved for the monarch, lesser portions given to nobles according to rank, and scraps thrown to the hounds that had helped secure the kill. Watching this division was like attending a miniature model of feudal society. Every person, from king to kennel boy, received their portion, reminding all of the rigid hierarchy that governed their world. The evening feasts extended the spectacle. Courtiers toasted the monarch's courage, poets recited verses comparing him to Alexander or Caesar, and musicians filled the halls with triumphant fanfare. The successful hunt became not just a meal, but a political rally, reinforcing the king's might and generosity. To be invited to such a feast was itself a privilege. To be seated close to the monarch was a mark of favour that could make or break careers. Thus, the medieval hunt did not end in the forest, but at the high table. The slain animal, once a symbol of nature's strength, was transformed into nourishment, ritual, and propaganda. In every slice of venison, in every raised goblet, the message was the same. The king hunts, the king feasts, and the king rules. To a medieval monarch, the forest was more than a playground. It was a parliament without walls. Invitations to a royal hunt were coveted as fiercely as seats at a council table. To ride beside the king in pursuit of a stag was to gain his ear in a way that no crowded hall could offer. Politics thrived in the woods, carried along with the sound of horns and the thunder of hooves. Unlike formal assemblies, where words were measured and scribes recorded every utterance, the hunt allowed for offhand conversations, subtle favours, and whispered promises. A noble might press his case for land or office between gallops. An ambitious courtier could demonstrate loyalty by keeping pace with the king through hours of grueling terrain, proving both physical stamina and political devotion. Failure to attend, on the other hand, could be seen as disrespect, or worse, a sign of waning loyalty. Hunting also served as a stage for testing relationships among nobles. Rivals rode together, often forced into proximity by the logistics of the chase. A misstep in etiquette, whether claiming a kill that should belong to another or letting one's hounds stray, could spark long-lasting enmity. Conversely, sharing in the triumph of a successful hunt could cement alliances, sealed later over venison and wine at the feast. Foreign dignitaries, too, were sometimes invited to join. For them, the hunt was not only a gesture of hospitality, but a demonstration of power. To watch the king control 100 hounds, or to see a falcon strike true at its prey, was to be reminded of his command over both nature and men. Diplomatic hunts could impress allies, intimidate rivals, and quietly reinforce a ruler's prestige without a word of negotiation spoken. But politics in the woods was not without its dangers. A poorly managed hunt could expose weaknesses. If the king was unseated, injured, or, heaven forbid, failed to bring down his quarry, whispers of incompetence could spread faster than wildfire. Success was essential, and huntsmen took care to stage manage outcomes, ensuring that the monarch's spear always found its mark. Thus, the medieval hunt was less about solitude in nature and more about ruling in motion. The forest, with its tangled paths and hidden clearings, became a moving court, a place where fortunes rose and fell, not in debates or duels, but in the gallop of hooves and the flight of arrows. For peasants, the royal hunt was less a spectacle than a sentence. While kings and nobles thundered through the woods in pursuit of glory, the common folk were bound by an iron cage of laws designed to protect both the game and the prestige of the crown. These forest laws, first imposed with vigour by William the Conqueror in England, turned everyday survival into criminal activity. To step into a royal preserve with a bow, even if only to catch a rabbit for a hungry family, was an act of defiance. The penalties were deliberately severe. Poachers could be fined into ruin, maimed, or even executed. Some accounts speak of eyes being gouged out or hands severed for the crime of killing a deer. Harsh, yes, but it was intended as a reminder. The beasts of the forest belonged not to the people, but to the king. Even gathering fallen wood or letting pigs forage for acorns could be treated as violations, depending on how zealously forest officials enforced the rules. This created a constant tension. The peasantry lived cheek by jowl with game they were forbidden to touch, watching deer eat their crops or boars tear up their fields, yet unable to lift a hand without risking punishment. In many villages, resentment simmered like an untended fire. Still, defiance persisted. Ballads and tales from the period often glorified the outlaw poacher, most famously Robin Hood, who stole from the king's forest and gave back to the people. These stories reveal a deep cultural frustration with the system. The royal hunt, for peasants, symbolized privilege at its most blatant, the sight of nobles riding out to slaughter animals that common folk were forbidden to trap, even as hunger gnawed at their bellies. Forest officials, known as verderers, foresters, or gamekeepers, enforced these laws with grim dedication. They became symbols of oppression in local law, despised as much as the lords they served. Yet they were essential, for without their vigilance, the king's exclusive hunting rights would collapse. Thus, the forest was not just a place of beauty or danger, it was a battleground of class. For the powerful, it was a theatre of authority. For the powerless, it was a cage, lined not with iron bars, but with antlers, tusks, and the sharp edge of royal decree. To call the medieval hunt a sport is to undersell its pageantry. Every outing was a performance designed to project the ruler's majesty. Horses gleamed with polished tack, huntsmen wore livery emblazoned with royal colours, and the monarch himself often donned garments that balanced practicality with splendour. Even in the mud of the forest, kings knew they were on display. The hunt became a living metaphor for kingship. Just as the ruler pursued the stag through tangled woods, so too did he chase justice, order, and dominion across his lands. Or at least, that was the image projected. Chroniclers leaned heavily on this symbolism, describing monarchs as tireless hunters whose mastery of beasts reflected their command over men. In illuminated manuscripts, kings are depicted not as weary riders, but as serene figures, calmly directing chaos with a raised hand or a blast of the horn. Ceremony surrounded nearly every moment. Trumpets signaled the start, drums or horns marked key phases of the chase, and rituals followed the kill. One common custom was the blowing of the mort, a haunting horn call played to honour the slain quarry. Far from being treated as mere carcasses, stags and boars were elevated into emblems of noble struggle. To kill them was not just to provide food, but to enact a symbolic victory over wildness itself. Religion was never far from these displays. Clergymen sometimes accompanied hunts, blessing the party or offering prayers before departure. The stag, in particular, carried Christian overtones, often associated with Christ or the soul's pursuit of salvation. Thus, when a king brought down a stag, it could be spun as both a triumph of monarchy and a faint echo of divine order. In this way, hunting blurred the line between ritual, politics, and faith. For the wider population, who might only glimpse the hunt from afar, the spectacle was unmistakable. Banners waving, horns echoing, hounds surging like a tide. It reminded peasants that they lived under a ruler, both mighty and ordained. Even the sound of horns rolling over the fields was a kind of royal proclamation. The king is present, the king is strong, the king commands. In truth, these hunts were less about venison and more about theatre. They reinforced hierarchy, cloaked violence in ritual, and bound kingship to the eternal rhythm of pursuit and conquest. By the late Middle Ages, the royal hunt had become so deeply entwined with rulership that it seemed impossible to imagine a king without hounds, hawks, or forests reserved for his use. And yet, the institution began to change as Europe transformed. Expanding towns ate into hunting preserves. The rise of standing armies shifted attention toward war rather than ritual hunts, and changing attitudes about land use slowly eroded the harsh grip of forest law. What was once a fierce monopoly softened into something closer to tradition. Still, the legacy of the hunt endured. Kings continued to hunt, of course. Henry VIII of England famously pursued stags with almost obsessive devotion, and French monarchs staged hunts as elaborate as any coronation. But the brutality of punishments for poaching gradually lessened, and forests that had once been forbidden to peasants became shared spaces. Over time, hunting retained its prestige, but lost some of its terror. The cultural imprint, however, never faded. Royal hunts had established a language of power, the stag as a symbol of nobility, the boar as a test of courage, the falcon as a metaphor for authority. These images lived on in coats of arms, in heraldry, and in the rituals of aristocracy. Even today, echoes remain. Fox hunting in England, or stag hunting traditions in Central Europe, carry with them the shadows of medieval spectacle. Perhaps most telling is how the idea of the king as hunter seeped into literature and imagination. Medieval poets often described rulers as hunters of justice or hunters of souls, while ballads celebrated outlaw heroes who defied the forest laws. The tension between ruler and poacher, privilege and hunger, became part of the cultural fabric. One might even argue that Robin Hood owes his lasting fame not to rebellion in general, but specifically to rebellion against the hunt. By the dawn of the Renaissance, the hunt had shifted from a ruthless tool of dominance to a more ceremonial pastime, still exclusive, still grand, but less about survival and more about display. Yet the echoes of its power persisted. For centuries, the sight of a mounted king chasing a stag across the land spoke louder than words. This is my forest, my quarry, my kingdom. And so, the royal hunts of the Middle Ages left behind more than venison bones and mounted antlers. They shaped law, culture, and memory, embedding themselves in Europe's understanding of what it meant to rule, to chase, to capture, and to conquer. In the spring of 324 BCE, the Persian city of Susa transformed into the stage for one of the most audacious displays of power and cultural fusion in antiquity. Alexander the Great, conqueror of half the known world, did not simply want to rule Persia. He wanted to merge it with Macedon into a single empire under his command. The occasion he chose for this bold experiment was a mass wedding of almost theatrical proportions. In a carefully orchestrated ceremony, Alexander himself married Statera, daughter of the late Persian king Darius III, while at the same time compelling around 80 of his top generals and companions to take Persian brides from the nobility. The grandeur of the event was staggering. Susa's palace, already famed for its wealth and luxury, was transformed into a glittering theatre of union. Chroniclers tell us that golden couches and silver tables were set for the feasting, with music and incense filling the halls. Brides, clad in rich Persian robes and heavy with jewels, were presented to their new Macedonian husbands in processions meant to awe both guests and participants. Alexander, seated like a living god, gave the impression that this was not simply a royal wedding, but the birth of a new world order. Yet beneath the splendour, unease simmered. For Persians, the marriages represented honour, their daughters now tied to the men who ruled their lands. For Macedonians, however, the event was jarring. These were men raised to view Persians as enemies, suddenly asked to take them as wives. Some grumbled that Alexander had abandoned his own people in favour of the customs of the conquered. Others resented the loss of choice, forced into unions that felt more like political commands than bonds of love. Still, Alexander pressed on with determination. The marriages were carefully symbolic, Macedonian power joined with Persian bloodlines, a physical metaphor for the empire he envisioned. And by taking a princess of Darius as his bride, Alexander was sending an unmistakable message. He was no mere conqueror, but the legitimate heir to the Persian throne. Thus, in the heart of Susa, amid silk banners and solemn vows, Alexander attempted something greater than conquest. He sought to turn war into kinship, enmity into alliance. Whether his generals approved or not, the mass marriages stood as one of the most controversial and symbolic gestures of his reign. At the heart of the Susa marriages stood Alexander's own union, a marriage loaded with more symbolism than affection. His chosen bride was Statira, the daughter of Darius III, the last Persian king he had defeated and pursued to his death. By wedding her, Alexander did not simply acquire a wife. He was laying claim to the legitimacy of Persia's royal bloodline. To Persian nobles, this was a profound gesture. Their conqueror had not dismissed their traditions or erased their monarchy. Instead, he bound himself to it, positioning himself as the natural heir of the Achaemenid throne. The ceremony itself was staged to underline this dual legacy. Alexander appeared dressed in Persian royal attire, blending Macedonian austerity with Eastern luxury. For his followers, it was a striking sight. Here was their king, once the proud son of Macedon, now draped in silk robes, golden jewellery, and a tiara befitting a Persian monarch. To the Persians in attendance, it was a welcome sign of respect for their culture. To the Macedonians, it was one more reminder that Alexander was slipping further from the traditions of his homeland. Statera herself, little more than a pawn in this grand political theatre, entered history's record largely as a symbol rather than as a person. Her marriage to Alexander was less about love and more about power, a union of dynasties intended to heal the wound of conquest. Through her, Alexander could claim continuity with Darius, a man he had once pursued across deserts and mountains. Through her, he became not only a conqueror of Persia, but its lawful king. The symbolism did not end with Statera. Alexander also married Parysatis, daughter of Artaxerxes III, another Persian monarch, doubling down on his claim to the Achaemenid dynasty. It was as though he sought to gather every thread of Persian legitimacy and weave it into his own crown. Yet for many Macedonians, the sight of their king embracing the daughters of their enemies was troubling. They had followed Alexander across Asia to topple Persia, not to join it. His marriage was meant as a bridge, but to some, it looked like betrayal. The tension between these perspectives hung over the event like a shadow, foreshadowing the resentment that would haunt Alexander's dream of a unified empire. If Alexander's own wedding to Stateira was a calculated move to secure legitimacy, the marriages he imposed on his generals were a blunt instrument of policy. Around 80 of his closest officers, men who had bled with him from the Granicus to the Indus, suddenly found themselves standing in line at Susa's palace, each paired with a Persian bride selected from the noble families of the empire. For some, the match was prestigious, even flattering. For many others, it was nothing short of an unwelcome command disguised as celebration. Imagine the scene. Hardened Macedonian veterans, men who had spent years carving through Persia's armies, now dressed in ceremonial robes, expected to exchange vows with daughters of the very aristocrats they had once fought. The women, draped in finery, were symbols of alliance rather than partners of affection. The unions were not born from choice, but from Alexander's vision of blending cultures, and his generals had little say in the matter. The resentment was real. Macedonian tradition valued choice in marriage, and though nobles often wed for political advantage, to be ordered into matrimony by their king was humiliating. Worse still, many already had wives waiting for them in Macedon. The new marriages raised awkward questions. Were their previous unions invalid now, or were they expected to juggle two worlds, one Greek, one Persian? Alexander, enamored with his vision of unity, brushed aside such concerns. The marriages would stand, and with them, the symbolic message that Macedonians and Persians were no longer enemies, but kin. Not everyone protested openly. Few dared to. But murmurs spread through the ranks. Some saw the marriages as another sign of their king going Persian, a ruler slipping further from the rough, straightforward culture of Macedon into the silken web of the East. For Alexander, this was precisely the point. He wanted his generals not only to rule Persians, but to become tied to them by family, by children, by blood. The banquet that followed was dazzling, a hall of feasting where Macedonian warriors sat beside their Persian brides, golden cups raised in uneasy toasts. But beneath the music and the laughter lay tension. The generals smiled for their king, but many silently wondered what price they would pay for a marriage not of their choosing. For the Persians, the mass weddings at Susa were not humiliations but affirmations. In their eyes, Alexander was no longer a foreign invader, but a ruler who sought to respect their traditions and integrate their nobility into the new order. By marrying Stateira, daughter of the defeated Darius III, and giving Persian brides to his generals, Alexander was sending a clear message. Persia was not conquered soil to be trampled, but a partner in shaping the empire's future. To Persian aristocrats, this was an extraordinary opportunity. Their daughters, once symbols of dynastic pride, were now bound to the most powerful warriors in the world. These unions offered security, wealth, and influence under the new regime. Instead of watching Macedonian governors impose foreign rule, Persian nobles could imagine their grandchildren inheriting a blended legacy, half Macedonian conqueror, half Persian heir. For families who feared being sidelined, the marriages provided a lifeline to continued relevance. The ceremonies themselves reflected Persian opulence. Brides were dressed in shimmering silk gowns embroidered with gold thread, their hair adorned with jewels and elaborate veils. They were escorted into the palace in solemn procession, accompanied by music, incense, and the watchful eyes of both Macedonian and Persian dignitaries. It was a spectacle meant to dazzle, and it did. For Persians in attendance, the sight of their daughters honoured and displayed at the heart of Alexander's empire was a sign that their traditions had not been erased, but elevated. There was also precedent. Persian kings had long used marriage as a political weapon, binding allies and rivals alike with carefully chosen unions. To them, Alexander was not betraying Greek custom, but wisely adopting Persian strategy. If anything, the mass weddings resembled an Achaemenid spectacle more than a Macedonian one, with Alexander consciously casting himself in the mould of the Persian great king. Yet even among Persians, there was some unease. Not every noble family rejoiced at the thought of their daughters wed to men who had marched across their lands with fire and sword. Some may have wondered whether these marriages were truly partnerships, or simply gilded chains binding them to Macedonian overlords. Still, the public face was one of honour and reconciliation. For Persia, the Susa weddings offered hope. Hope that bloodlines might heal where battlefields had scarred, that the conqueror's empire could become their empire too. If the ceremonies of marriage symbolized unity, the banquet that followed was designed to overwhelm the senses and burn Alexander's vision into memory. Ancient sources describe a feast of such scale and opulence that it rivaled anything staged by the old Persian kings. In Susa's great hall, long tables groaned under the weight of golden vessels, silver platters, and countless delicacies drawn from across the empire. Bread from the fertile Nile, spices from India, game from Persian forests, and wine in such abundance that fountains are said to have flowed with it. Alexander presided like a figure halfway between king and god, seated beside his new bride Stateira, and flanked by generals with their own Persian wives. The hall glittered with candlelight reflected in polished bronze and precious stones, while musicians played lutes and flutes, and dancers entertained the mingling crowds. Each toast, each song, was another reminder that this was not just a feast, but a political performance. The highlight of the evening came when Alexander ordered gifts for the thousands of guests. Accounts suggest he distributed dowries for each bride, lavish rewards for the grooms, and generous handouts for soldiers and attendants alike. It was a masterstroke of propaganda. No one left the hall without some tangible reminder of the king's largesse. Even the hounds that had followed the army on campaign were said to have been fed choice cuts of venison from golden trays. And yet, beneath the golden glow, the atmosphere was complicated. Macedonian veterans, many of whom had endured years of hardship on campaign, muttered into their cups at being forced into foreign unions. They smiled and accepted gifts, but their hearts were not in the celebrations. Meanwhile, Persian nobles took pride in the recognition, seeing their daughters honoured in a ceremony that placed them at the heart of the empire's future. The banquet of Susa, then, was not merely a feast, but a theatre of empire. Every gesture, from the pouring of wine to the distribution of gifts, was calculated to symbolize harmony. Alexander wanted his men, and his new Persian in-laws alike, to believe they were all bound together now by blood and loyalty. For a single night, under the blazing lights of Susa, the dream of fusion seemed real. A vast empire united at one table. For many of Alexander's Macedonian companions, the marriages at Susa were not a celebration, but a humiliation. These were men forged in the rugged traditions of the Balkans, warriors who had marched behind Philip II, and then Alexander himself in the conquest of Greece, Persia, and beyond. They were bound by loyalty to their king, but their loyalty was being stretched thin. To marry Persian women, and not by choice but by command, was to them a betrayal of the values they had grown up with. Macedonian marriage was traditionally a matter of personal decision or clan alliance, not royal decree. To be forced into matrimony felt unnatural, even degrading. Worse still, many of these officers already had wives back home. Were they now expected to abandon them, or would they be compelled to maintain two households, torn between Macedonian tradition and Persian expectation? Alexander, blinded by his vision of fusion, seemed unconcerned with such practical and emotional realities. The resentment went deeper than personal grievances. To many Macedonians, the marriages symbolized their king's troubling transformation. They had once followed Alexander with pride as he outmaneuvered Persian armies and toppled their great king. Now they saw him draped in Persian robes, adopting Persian court rituals and marrying not one but two Persian princesses. To them, it looked as though Alexander was slowly becoming the very thing they had fought to destroy. Whispers spread through the camp. Soldiers muttered that their king was more interested in pleasing Persians than honouring the men who had carried him to victory. Some veterans sneered at the notion of raising half-Persian heirs, fearing that Macedonian bloodlines would be diluted. Others saw in the weddings an ominous foreshadowing. If Alexander could command them to marry, what else might he demand in the future? This discontent did not erupt into open rebellion. Not yet. But it simmered. The same soldiers who raised golden cups at the banquet clenched their jaws behind forced smiles. They had endured endless marches, battles, and losses for Alexander. Now they wondered whether his dream of a blended empire came at the expense of their own identity. Thus, the mass weddings at Susa were both triumph and fracture. While Persians saw unity, Macedonians saw erosion. In their eyes, Alexander was drifting further from the rugged simplicity of Macedon and deeper into the silk-wrapped world of Persia, and many would never forgive him for it. The mass marriages at Susa were not an isolated stunt. They were the centerpiece of Alexander's grand design, a vision of blending East and West into a single seamless empire. From the moment he marched into Persia, Alexander had shown signs that he did not intend to rule as a foreign conqueror. He adopted Persian dress, used Persian titles, and retained many local administrators in power. The weddings, however, were the boldest and most symbolic step yet. By physically joining his generals with Persian nobility, Alexander hoped to erase the divide between ruler and ruled, conqueror and conquered. This policy of fusion was revolutionary, but also deeply personal. Alexander had grown up on stories of Achilles and Homeric heroes, but he was also a keen student of philosophy. He envisioned himself not merely as king of Macedon, but as a universal monarch, bridging cultures and creating a new identity beyond nationality. He believed that by blending Macedonian courage with Persian sophistication, he could forge an empire stronger than either culture alone. The marriages were meant to serve as living metaphors for this idea. Children born from these unions would be both Macedonian and Persian, heirs of two traditions bound by blood. Over generations, Alexander imagined, this new hybrid aristocracy would erase old resentments and give his empire a unified ruling class. The banquet, the ceremonies, the gold and silk, all were part of this grand narrative of unity, but lofty ideals often collide with human realities. While Persians welcomed the gesture, Macedonians resisted. To them, Alexander's dream was less about fusion and more about erasure of their traditions, their pride, and even their sense of superiority as conquerors. Yet Alexander pressed on, convinced that the future lay not in separation but in synthesis. His policies went beyond marriage. He encouraged his men to learn Persian customs, promoted Persians into military and administrative roles, and even trained young Persians in Macedonian fighting styles to blend armies as well as families. These moves alarmed many of his old guard, but they thrilled those Persians who saw in Alexander not a destroyer, but a rebuilder. Thus, the mass marriages at Susa were the crown jewel of Alexander's dream, not just a wedding feast, but the first step toward a new kind of empire. Whether his soldiers liked it or not, Alexander was determined to bind East and West together, even if it meant tying knots with golden chains. For all the splendor of Susa, the mass marriages did not age well. In the immediate years, they bound Macedonian officers to Persian noble houses, but the glue was weak, held together more by Alexander's authority than by genuine affection. When Alexander died suddenly in Babylon in 323 BCE, his vision of fusion collapsed almost overnight. Without his presence to enforce the unions, many Macedonian generals quickly abandoned their Persian brides, returning to their earlier marriages or seeking new alliances more convenient for the political chaos that followed. The abandonment was brutal for the Persian women. For them, the marriages had been more than pageantry. They were a path to influence, security, and survival in a conquered empire. Some had borne children who were now left with uncertain futures, caught between two worlds that no longer wanted to merge. The bitterness of this betrayal highlighted the fragile foundations of Alexander's policy. Forced loyalty could not outlast the man who demanded it. The Susa weddings also fueled tension in the wars of succession. The generals who once dined together as brothers-in-law turned on one another in bloody conflicts known as the Wars of the Diadochi. Any dream of unity dissolved into rival kingdoms, each ruled by men who had once been tied to Persian dynasties, but were now too busy carving up Alexander's empire to honor those bonds. Instead of fostering cohesion, the marriages became little more than footnotes in the broader disintegration of his vision. And yet, traces of Alexander's idea lingered. Some children of these unions survived and played roles in local politics. In certain regions, the blending of Macedonian and Persian elites did leave cultural marks, in art, in fashion, in customs adopted by later dynasties. But the sweeping harmony Alexander had imagined never materialized. The resentment among Macedonians and the abandonment of Persian brides proved that cultural fusion could not be forced with golden rings and wedding vows. In hindsight, the aftermath of Susa revealed both Alexander's genius and his hubris. He saw further than most rulers of his age, envisioning a world where enemies became kin. But he overestimated the willingness of men to embrace change, and underestimated how quickly his death would unravel everything. The Susa marriages ended not as a lasting legacy of unity, but as a symbol of how fragile even the grandest dreams can be when tied too tightly to one man's will. Though the marriages at Susa dissolved almost as quickly as the wedding torches were extinguished, their symbolism echoed through history. They became one of the most striking examples of Alexander's ambition, not merely to conquer, but to transform. Historians have long debated whether the weddings represented genuine vision or reckless theatre. Was Alexander truly attempting to fuse East and West into a single people? Or was he staging a glittering show to remind his subjects that he alone stood above all divisions? To later generations, the event came to embody both Alexander's brilliance and his excess. On one hand, it demonstrated a rare willingness to respect conquered traditions. Few rulers of antiquity would have risked angering their own people by elevating the daughters of former enemies to royal status. On the other hand, the Susa weddings revealed the limits of forced integration. Macedonian resentment and Persian disillusionment showed that cultural fusion cannot simply be commanded, no matter how golden the banquet halls. In the centuries that followed, the marriages were remembered as a failed experiment, but also as a glimpse of possibilities ahead of their time. Later empires, from Rome to Byzantium, would grapple with the same question Alexander posed. How do you govern vast, diverse populations without collapsing under the weight of division? His attempt to bind cultures together through kinship may have faltered, but the idea itself would outlive him. Culturally, the weddings left faint, but telling traces. Art from the Hellenistic world shows Persian influences in clothing, ornament, and ceremony. Greek writers continued to reflect on Alexander's Persian turn, alternately praising and condemning it. For Persians, the memory was bittersweet. Their daughters had been honored, yet abandoned. Their dynasties linked to greatness, yet dismissed in the chaos after Alexander's death. The legacy of Susa, then, is one of paradox. It was both a triumph of vision and a failure of execution, a dazzling ceremony that revealed the promise and peril of blending worlds. In one hall, for one night, Macedonians and Persians dined together as kin. But by dawn, the cracks were already visible. Ultimately, the Susa weddings endure in memory because they were never just about marriage. They were about empire, identity, and the eternal human struggle between unity and division. A reminder that while Alexander could conquer lands with his armies, he could not as easily conquer the hearts of his own men. Life in Alexander's army was an endless rhythm of marches, sieges, and bloodshed. but even the most hardened warriors needed moments of release. Between campaigns, when the dust of conquest temporarily settled, the Macedonian camp transformed from a machine of war into a stage of celebration. These were no ordinary pauses. They were festivals, gatherings filled with athletic contests, sacrifices, feasting, and theatre that reminded soldiers they were more than tools of conquest. They were part of something greater, a brotherhood bound by both steel and tradition. The timing of these festivals was never accidental. Victories often sparked them, turning battlefields into ceremonial grounds. A city taken, a river crossed, a rebellion crushed, all could become reasons to celebrate. Even long marches might culminate in games to keep morale high and spirits sharpened. Soldiers who had endured blistering deserts or freezing mountain passes suddenly found themselves spectators or participants in rituals that carried echoes of Greece itself. In these moments, the army resembled less a ragged host of warriors and more a travelling polis, a city on the move. Central to the celebrations were athletic contests. Macedonians prided themselves on strength, endurance, and skill, qualities equally vital on the battlefield and in sport. Wrestling, foot races, and spear throwing turned the camp into a makeshift Olympic arena. Victors were crowned with wreaths, cheered by comrades who only days earlier had stood beside them in phalanx formation. Friendly rivalries flourished, and the games reinforced discipline. The soldier who outran his peers in a race might be the same man to carry a critical message in war. Sacrifice and ritual bound these contests together. Before the games began, priests slaughtered bulls, goats, or rams to the gods, their blood spilled as offerings to secure divine favour for both the festival and the campaigns to come. Smoke from burning fat and incense rose into the sky, mingling with the shouts of soldiers eager for spectacle. In these moments, Macedonians remembered that they were heirs of both Homer's warriors and Greece's sacred traditions. Thus, between war and celebration, lay the heart of Alexander's genius. He understood that soldiers needed more than pay and plunder. They needed identity, shared pride, and the reminder that even far from home, they remained part of a culture worth fighting for. At the heart of Macedonian military festivals were the games themselves, athletic contests that mirrored both the ideals of Greece and the demands of the battlefield. These events were not simple diversions. They were training grounds disguised as entertainment, rituals that kept warriors sharp in body and spirit while fostering loyalty among comrades. Foot races were among the most popular. Soldiers stripped down, oiled their bodies, and sprinted across dusty fields while their comrades roared encouragement. Speed was not just a matter of pride, but a military necessity. The ability to run in armour, deliver messages, or outflank an enemy often meant the difference between victory and annihilation. Winning a race earned cheers and wreaths, but more importantly, it won respect. A man who could outpace others was seen as an asset in battle, his skill publicly proven before the eyes of the king and the army. Wrestling was another staple. Grappling contests took place in makeshift arenas marked by sand or earth, where soldiers locked arms in tests of balance and strength. Wrestling taught discipline, endurance, and quick thinking, qualities essential in phalanx formations, where one soldier's faltering grip could topple the line. Victors were celebrated for both their skill and their toughness, for to wrestle in front of peers was to prove resilience not just physically, but mentally. Javelin throwing and archery carried obvious military value. Soldiers competed to hurl spears the farthest, or strike targets with precision, contests that sharpened the same skills they would use against enemies. A soldier who could pierce a distant target in competition could just as easily strike an enemy shield in battle. These games transformed practice into prestige, rewarding accuracy and strength with immediate honour. The contests were often accompanied by music, cheers, and the awarding of simple prizes, wreaths of olive or laurel, symbols harkening back to Olympia. But the true reward was less tangible. Victories were immortalized in the memory of comrades, strengthening bonds of pride and camaraderie. Even those who lost gained from the spectacle. They learned humility, resilience, and the encouragement to train harder for the next festival. In these contests, the Macedonian army was more than a band of killers. It was a living brotherhood that celebrated its own skill and discipline. And through every race, grapple, and throw, Alexander's soldiers reminded themselves why they were feared across the world. Because they were not just fighters, but athletes of war. No Macedonian festival began without the gods. For Alexander and his men, victory in battle and triumph in games both required divine approval. Before the races and contests commenced, priests and officials prepared altars in the center of the camp, draped in garlands and adorned with sacred fire. Soldiers gathered in ranks, their armor gleaming in the sun, while silence fell over the crowd. The festival was not only entertainment, it was a sacred act. Sacrifices set the tone. Bulls, goats, or rams were brought forward, their horns gilded or their hides sprinkled with barley. A priest raised his hands to the heavens, calling on Zeus, Heracles, and other gods favored by the Macedonians. The animals were then slaughtered in solemn ceremony, their blood spilled onto the earth as an offering. Smoke from burning fat and incense curled upward, carrying prayers for protection and victory in campaigns to come. For the soldiers, this was reassurance. The gods had not abandoned them, even on foreign soil thousands of miles from home. These rituals also reinforced hierarchy. Alexander, often presiding in person, stood as both king and high priest. By offering sacrifices before his troops, he was not only honoring the gods, but reminding the army that his authority was sanctioned by them. To obey Alexander was to obey divine will. This fusion of piety and politics gave the festivals a gravity beyond simple amusement. After the sacrifices, feasting followed. Meat from the animals was roasted and distributed among the troops. Sharing in the sacred meal transformed the army into a single family, bound by both ritual and appetite. Eating from the same sacrifice was more than nourishment. It was a symbolic act of unity, a reminder that all soldiers, from seasoned generals to common infantry, shared equally in the god's blessing. Theatrical performances sometimes accompanied these rituals. Actors or musicians reenacted episodes from Homer, or sang hymns that glorified both the gods and Alexander's victories. In this way, ritual, art, and sport blended seamlessly into a cultural celebration that felt both Greek and uniquely Macedonian. Through sacrifice and ritual, the festivals reminded Alexander's soldiers of their identity. They were not mercenaries fighting for pay. They were warriors of a sacred mission, chosen by the gods and led by a king who honored them with blood, fire, and feast. Beyond the races and sacrifices, Alexander's military festivals also echoed the cultural heartbeat of Greece: theatre. Even far from home, amid the dust of Asia or the deserts of Persia, soldiers found themselves gathered in makeshift amphitheatres, where drama, music, and poetry wove together celebration and identity. These performances reminded the troops that they were not just conquerors, they were heirs to Greek civilization itself. Temporary stages were erected from wood and cloth, often in the shadow of captured cities or in cleared spaces within the camp. Actors donned masks and costumes, some improvised, some carried along with the army's baggage. The repertoire ranged from tragedies of Aeschylus and Euripides to comedies of Aristophanes, works that soldiers had grown up hearing in their youth. Watching them performed in distant lands was a powerful reminder of continuity. The same words that had echoed in Athens and Macedon now resounded on the banks of the Indus. Theatre served more than entertainment. It carried moral weight. Tragedies spoke of hubris, fate, and the will of the gods. Themes that resonated with men marching under Alexander, who himself seemed larger than life. Comedies, meanwhile, offered relief, lampooning authority and poking fun at daily hardships. Laughter in camp was as essential as discipline, and the performances gave soldiers a chance to forget, if only for an evening, the brutal realities of war. Music was ever present. Flutes, lyres, and drums accompanied performances, filling the air with rhythms that could stir pride or soothe weariness. Songs of Homeric heroes were sung, linking Alexander's men to Achilles and Odysseus, reminding them that their struggles were part of a larger heroic tradition. Dancers sometimes joined, their movements symbolic of victory, sacrifice, or even comic relief. These cultural events also reinforced loyalty to Alexander. He often sponsored the performances personally, inviting poets and actors to join the campaign. By providing theatre and music, Alexander gave his men not just pay or plunder, but culture, the very thing that distinguished Greeks from barbarians in their own eyes. The soldiers were reminded that wherever they marched, they carried Greece with them. Thus, in the laughter of comedies, the solemnity of tragedies, and the rhythm of music, the festivals bound the army not only as warriors, but as a community of culture. In those moments, Alexander's camp was less a battlefield and more a city alive with art, pride, and shared identity. No Macedonian festival was complete without food and drink, and plenty of both. After the sacrifices and games, the camp erupted into feasts that blurred the line between ritual and revelry. Fires blazed, spits turned with roasting meat, and soldiers sat together in long rows, drinking, laughing, and retelling stories of battles past. For men who had endured endless marches and the horrors of war, the banquet was more than indulgence. It was healing, camaraderie, and affirmation that their suffering bound them as brothers. The meals often began with the distribution of sacrificial meat. This was no ordinary dinner, but a sacred act. All soldiers partook of the same offering, a sign that they shared equally in the gods' favour. Kings and commoners alike ate from the same beasts, though Alexander and his generals sat at central tables, visible reminders of hierarchy within unity. The ritual made clear that while all were bound together, order still prevailed. Wine flowed in staggering quantities. Amphorae were cracked open, cups passed hand to hand, and toasts rang out in honour of the gods, the king, and fallen comrades. Drinking contests were common, sometimes spiralling into wild displays of bravado. Macedonians, notorious for their hard drinking, turned these moments into tests of endurance no less competitive than the athletic games. To outdrink a rival was to claim a small victory in honour and pride, though more than a few ended the night sprawled in the dust, defeated by Dionysus rather than Persians. Feasts were also occasions for storytelling. Veterans recounted battles, exaggerating feats of courage while comrades jeered or cheered. Musicians played flutes and lyres, while dancers performed, weaving entertainment into the merriment. These shared experiences created memories as powerful as any oath of loyalty. When men laughed, drank, and sang together, they forged bonds that would carry them into the next campaign with renewed spirit. Alexander himself often presided over these gatherings, visible and approachable. He raised cups alongside his soldiers, reminding them that he was not only their king, but their comrade in arms. These moments of shared humanity strengthened his charisma and deepened loyalty. Soldiers could say they had eaten and drunk with the conqueror of Asia, an intimacy no amount of coin could buy. Thus, the feasts of the Macedonian festivals were not mere excess. They were glue, binding an army of thousands into one body, one voice, one memory. Around the fire, with meat in hand and wine on their lips, Alexander's soldiers found the spirit that made them unstoppable. While feasts and theatre fed the spirit, martial displays fed the pride of an army that lived for war. At Alexander's military festivals, soldiers were not content with foot races and wrestling alone. They demonstrated the very skills that made Macedon feared across the world: mock battles, cavalry drills, and weapon contests that blurred the line between training and spectacle. These were not only thrilling to watch, but essential reminders of the discipline that kept the empire together. Phalanx demonstrations were crowd favourites. Soldiers marched in tight formation, shields interlocked, and spears levelled like a living wall of iron. To the casual onlooker, it was a show of power. To the veterans, it was rehearsal for survival. Even in celebration, Precision was demanded. Any faltering line brought jeers from the crowd and harsh rebukes from officers. The spectacle reinforced a sobering truth. The games might be festive, but war was never far away. Cavalry displays were equally dramatic. Companion horsemen, Alexander's elite riders, thundered across open fields in dazzling maneuvers, wheeling and charging in perfect unison. Horses draped in bronze fittings gleamed in the sun, while lances lowered in mock charges stirred both admiration and intimidation. For Persians and other conquered peoples invited to watch, these displays were a reminder that Alexander's army was not only powerful in battle, but endlessly prepared for the next. Weapon contests added a competitive edge. Archers tested their aim at distant targets, while javelineers hurled spears for distance and accuracy. Swordsmen performed choreographed duels, clashing blades in controlled, yet electrifying displays of speed and ferocity. Victors earned roars of approval, but even the losers were celebrated for their bravery. To compete was to honor the army, and each contest reminded the men that their skills, honed through endless campaigns, were the bedrock of Macedonian supremacy. Mock battles sometimes capped these displays, with two companies of soldiers squaring off in simulated combat. Dust rose, spears clashed, and shouts rang out as though a real enemy had appeared. The audience cheered with the same fervor they might show in actual battle, turning drills into theatre. For the men in formation, it was both practice and pride, a chance to prove themselves before their king and comrades. In these martial displays, Alexander's army celebrated not by laying down arms, but by wielding them. The festivals reminded every soldier that their glory was not only in conquest, but in the relentless skill, unity, and discipline that made Macedon unstoppable. At the center of every Macedonian festival stood Alexander himself. The games, feasts, sacrifices, and performances were not simply diversions for weary soldiers. They were carefully orchestrated rituals designed to draw the army closer to its king. Alexander understood better than most rulers that loyalty was not maintained by fear alone. It had to be nurtured through shared experiences, visible presence, and gestures that reminded his men they were part of his story, not merely pawns in it. During festivals, Alexander often appeared not as the distant monarch enthroned above his people, but as a comrade among them. He competed in contests, sometimes racing or throwing the spear, demonstrating that he too was subject to the same tests of strength and courage. When he feasted, he drank from the same wine as his men, laughed at the same songs, and raised toasts in memory of fallen comrades. These acts blurred the line between king and soldier, creating the impression of shared brotherhood. For warriors who had marched thousands of miles under his banner, such intimacy was priceless. At the same time, the festivals elevated Alexander beyond ordinary mortals. Sacrifices to Zeus, Heracles, or even to himself as a demigod linked his leadership to divine approval. Priests invoked his name alongside the gods, and theatrical performances celebrated his victories as though they belonged to myth. The dual image was powerful, Alexander as both companion and chosen leader of destiny. The festivals also served as moments of reward. Soldiers were given gifts, promotions, or public praise in front of their peers. Nothing bound a man tighter to his king than recognition in the eyes of the army. A simple crown of olive or a golden cup awarded by Alexander carried more weight than a fortune, for it signified that the king himself had witnessed and honored a man's deeds. In this way, loyalty was constantly reinforced. The soldiers saw Alexander as one of them, and yet above them, a man who shared their hardships while embodying their highest aspirations. The festivals were not only celebrations, but acts of political genius, welding thousands of individuals into a single loyal body centered around their king. For Macedonian soldiers, loyalty was not abstract. It was lived, in laughter beside the fire, in games under the sun, and in the presence of a leader who seemed destined to rule the world. The festivals were not staged for Macedonian eyes alone. Conquered peoples, allied rulers, and envoys from distant lands were often invited to witness the celebrations, turning them into powerful displays of propaganda. For Alexander, the games were as much about sending a message as they were about entertaining his troops. Each race, sacrifice, and feast was carefully curated theatre, designed to prove that Macedon's power was not only military, but cultural, spiritual, and inevitable. Imagine a Persian noble or an Egyptian priest watching the Macedonian phalanx perform mock maneuvers before an audience roaring with pride, or seeing companion cavalry charge across a dusty field in perfect formation, lances gleaming like the rays of Helios. These spectacles announced with unmistakable clarity, this army does not rest, does not weaken, and will never be overtaken. To subjects and allies, it was both awe-inspiring and intimidating, a reminder that Alexander's rule was backed by discipline as well as divinity. The religious rituals carried equal weight. Sacrifices offered in the name of both Greek gods and local deities demonstrated Alexander's flexibility, portraying him as a ruler who could bridge worlds. Festivals thus reinforced his carefully cultivated image. Conqueror, yes, but also unifier. For Persians, Indians, or Egyptians drawn into his empire, the sight of their traditions honoured alongside Greek customs suggested that they were not simply being crushed, but incorporated into something grander. Theatre and music amplified the message. Dramas about Achilles or Heracles drew parallels between Alexander and legendary heroes, blurring the line between human king and mythic figure. To foreign guests, the implication was unavoidable. Resistance to Alexander was not only futile, it was impious. He was favoured by the gods, celebrated by his people, and unstoppable in his destiny. Even the feasting carried political undertones. To sit at Alexander's table, or even to observe it, was to glimpse the hierarchy of his world. Generals and nobles closest to him basked in the glow of favour, while lesser officers and foreign dignitaries understood their place within the grand mosaic of the empire. In short, these festivals were propaganda disguised as joy. They reassured Macedonians, impressed foreigners, and projected a narrative of unity under Alexander's rule. The games and rituals were not simply pastimes, they were deliberate instruments of control, weaving loyalty, fear, and admiration into a spectacle that no guest could ignore. When historians look back at Alexander's campaigns, they often focus on the battles, the sieges, and the endless marches that carried his army from Greece to India. Yet the festivals that filled the pauses between campaigns revealed just as much about why his empire endured as long as it did. These gatherings were not mere distractions. They were the glue that bound thousands of men into a single organism, reminding them of who they were, why they fought, and whom they served. The athletic contests left a lasting impression, echoing the Olympic ideals of Greece while sharpening the skills of warriors. They kept the army fit, competitive, and proud, turning even moments of rest into preparation for war. Ritual sacrifices and shared feasts reinforced the belief that the gods stood alongside Macedon, their blessings poured into every cup of wine and every piece of roasted meat. Theatre and music gave the soldiers a cultural lifeline, linking them back to their homeland, even as they marched deeper into unfamiliar lands. The propaganda value of these festivals also endured. By showcasing discipline and unity to foreign eyes, Alexander turned entertainment into diplomacy, making conquered peoples respect, if not love, the empire they now belonged to. These spectacles carried a message more persuasive than any sword. Macedon was not only powerful in battle, but unshakable in spirit. Most importantly, the festivals reinforced the charisma of Alexander himself. He was seen both as a companion in revelry and as a semi-divine figure presiding over rituals. This duality cemented loyalty in a way few rulers have ever achieved. His men could boast that they had feasted, raced, and sacrificed beside their king, while also believing they served someone chosen by the gods. The legacy of these gatherings survived long after Alexander's death. His successors, the Diadochi, imitated them, holding games and festivals to honor their armies and legitimize their rule. Though the empire fractured, the memory of those celebrations lingered, proof that discipline and joy, war and culture could coexist under a single banner. In the end, the Macedonian military festivals were more than diversions. They were rituals of unity, carefully woven into the fabric of conquest. They gave soldiers reason to endure, foreigners reason to admire, and Alexander reason to believe that his empire could outlast him. For a moment, between blood and dust, they created a vision of harmony that was as vital to victory as any spear or shield.